Pakistan backtracks on an earlier decision to resume trade ties with India. Is a détente between the two nuclear-armed neighbours still likely? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Pakistan on Thursday postponed a decision to allow imports of cotton and sugar from neighbouring India until New Delhi reviews its 2019 move suspending Kashmir's autonomy. The two rivals have been locked in a frosty standoff, but in recent weeks there have been signs of a thaw in relations. India and Pakistan agreed to a ceasefire after decades of tensions and violence along their shared border. And for the first time in 3 years, the two sides met to discuss water sharing in the Indus River. For more on India-Pakistan relations, let's get straight to our panel. Sumit Ganguly is a political science professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. Joining us here in Washington, Mosharraf Zaidi is senior fellow of Pakistan-based think tank Tabadlab and a former principal advisor to Pakistan's foreign minister. Ather Zia is assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley. And also with us in Washington, Michael Kugelman is deputy director and senior associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Sumit Ganguly, let me start with you. There are promising signs that both sides want to improve relations. Both sides have exchanged letters expressing very warm sentiments. But the latest is that Pakistan has postponed this decision to import cotton and sugar from India. This is what the Pakistan Foreign Minister, Shah Mahmood Qureshi, had to say. Let's listen.
There was an impression that the relations with India were going towards normalization and that trade has resumed. This also came under the discussion. There was a unanimous opinion and the Prime Minister also agreed.
So, Sumit, where does this leave the talks? What does it mean?
It probably means a temporary pause. I don't think the talks will be stalled indefinitely, but this is obviously a bit of a setback, I'm afraid, and I am not entirely surprised that there was a domestic backlash because sentiments in Pakistan are probably a bit on the raw side, especially in light of India's decision in 2019 to federalize the Indian-controlled portion of the state of Jammu and Kashmir that led to hostile sentiments in Pakistan, and not entirely surprisingly so. This abrupt decision to import certain commodities from India has generated a domestic backlash, but I don't think that this is going to derail the forthcoming talks.
So would it be fair to say, Sumit, that this is just a bit of diplomatic maneuvering on Pakistan's part?
It's not so much diplomatic maneuvering as much as a response to domestic politics and domestic public opinion. And since domestic public opinion on India does matter when dealing with critical questions in bilateral relations, obviously the elected government felt that it had to at least throw a sop to aggrieved communities within the country.
Mosharraf Zaidi, what is your view on what is taking place right now? Pakistan, it seems, is looking for a concession from India on Kashmir before it will resume trade ties. What's your view on where these talks will go and what's driving this process?
The process itself, I think, is being driven by a realization and an acceptance in Pakistan that the price of competition with India is no longer tenable in the medium and long term. And therefore, it is more useful for Pakistan to engage, as it has been advised to do for many decades by its iron brother China, by the United States, and by many other allies and friends, increasingly, including those in the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's much more useful for Pakistan to pursue a geoeconomics-led strategy for national growth and development. And in order to do that, it needs to be able to dial down the temperature as far as India is concerned. The extent to which I would contest the language, at least semantically, if not much more functionally, of looking for a concession. I think the problem is that the West and the East, frankly, across the world, India has been given a carte blanche for everything that it's done, particularly what it's done vis-a-vis Kashmir. But remember that before the August 5th annexation of occupied Kashmir, there was also the Balakot attack on Pakistan. In both cases, I think the fact that the Pakistani security establishment and political leadership have dealt with India in a manner that is best described as extreme patience and hesitancy to escalate up the ladder means that this is really the strategic direction Pakistan wants to take. The big question, I think, that needs to be posed is not so much what is Pakistan going to do. Pakistan, I think, is going to continue down this path, I think, as Mr. Ganguly quite rightly pointed out. I think the real question is whether there's any appetite at all within New Delhi, and particularly in South Bloc, to stop trying to punish Pakistan and actually engage with its neighbor and meet it halfway.
Mosharraf, when you say there is something of a realization in Pakistan that the tensions with India are no longer tenable, how much of a change, I mean, how big is the shift in thinking? How significant is it?
I think the thinking has been there basically since after Kargil, which was 1999. So we're looking at a 2-decade-plus process. But there are both domestic compulsions of the nature that Sumit Ganguly points to, but also there have been frankly contradictions within a range of policy instruments that Pakistan has sought to pursue its legitimate political interests in Kashmir. And some of those policy instruments have frankly gone out of fashion. And that too is now a 20-year sort of process. It's been a quarter century that Pakistani policy leaders have known that the things that might have worked or might have been tenable in the 1990s are no longer tenable. And therefore, it's increasingly important for Pakistan to engage on, as I said, a platform of geoeconomics rather than any other kind of approach to its national power.
Right. Ather Zia, there is now a ceasefire along the Kashmir border, but both sides seem very entrenched in their positions. Is there likelihood of a compromise here after these talks?
You mean when we are talking about a compromise, you mean between the countries, or are you...
Between Pakistan and India on the Kashmir issue?
Well, we do have to look at it in the context of what the ceasefire actually means for the Kashmiri people and also for the larger countries. It's a re-establishment of a prior agreement that has happened in 2003. And of course, since 2007, after the regime change in Washington, things have started, things escalated, and there have been violations across the LOC. And we have to look at it in that context, that it doesn't really mean a lot for Kashmiris themselves vis-a-vis change in Kashmir policy, so to speak, for both countries. It's just something that has been done by and large within the rubric of regime change, and because Biden and the policy is more pluralistic, and they are asking them to restore peace across the LOC. So for Kashmiris themselves, they don't see this as a big compromise between the two countries. I don't think that's the opinion on ground. It is going to bring some relief to the LOC and the people around, but by and large, right now, what Kashmir is in is a status quo, the post-2019, the re-annexation that has happened. So that's where Kashmiris and Kashmir stands at the moment.
Michael Kugelman, what's at stake here? Why do you think these two countries feel that they've got to the point now where they have to improve relations? Why now?
Well, I think there's many things at play. I think, for one, both countries are going through a lot internally. The pandemic, economic struggle, that's been a major story for the last year. And I think that, as Mosharraf had said as well, I think there's a recognition, at least on the Pakistan side, that it's time to move on. And, we're not necessarily saying that there's going to be peace breaking out anytime soon, far from it. But I think that both sides would conclude that they'd be better off by having more space to engage with each other, and even if on limited levels through some modest stepped up trade, which, as we know, that's not going to happen just yet, but it could come. and also perhaps through some cooperation in the space of responding to the pandemic. I think there's a recognition of that. On the Indian side, I really do think that New Delhi calculated that it's very concerned about its border with China right now, given what happened last year. I think that it wanted to have an opportunity to free up more policy space and bandwidth to focus on that issue, and that would require not feeling bogged down on its border with Pakistan. And meanwhile, on the Pakistan side, I think there's a recognition that the Biden administration in Washington is going to be looking to Islamabad to work with the United States in the peace process in Afghanistan, and a recognition that the administration would expect Pakistan to expend more efforts in that game than it has to this point. And that, again, also would require Pakistan to not be bogged down on its border with India and not be as concerned about that issue. So I think there's a lot of factors across the board. But I think that a very clear picture has emerged here. There was buy-in from both India and Pakistan to bring the violence under control on the border because it had really gotten out of control. It's the worst it's been in several decades. And then that got the border truce. And then from that point, a desire to use that as a springboard for some modest confidence-building measures, as noted before. But bottom line is we should not expect this to lead to some grand march toward peace, because I think the so-called core issues, the Kashmir issue from Pakistan's side and the issue of terrorism in Pakistan from the Indian side, those are not issues where I see a lot of headway being made in ways that would satisfy each side.
Sumit Ganguly, what do you make of Michael's point that India is seeing tensions on two borders right now, on the border with Pakistan as well as that with China, and it would like to defuse tensions at least on one border?
Quite frankly, I think he's exactly right. That India can ill afford to have a two-front situation confronting it, and consequently needs a quieter border with Pakistan. And he's also correct in pointing out that the hostilities along the line of control had really reached an apogee in the last few months, and there were constant reports of firing on from both sides of the border, with people who live along the border bearing the brunt of this firing and the like. And the recent developments on the Sino-Indian border have really concentrated the minds of the Indian military, which does not want to have to confront a two-front situation. And consequently, it makes sense to try and at least ease matters along one front where it's eminently feasible.
Sumit, Kashmir remains the biggest obstacle to better relations between these two South Asian neighbors. But, as we said in our introduction, they have agreed to some extent on water sharing from the Indus River. Where are the other opportunities right now where these two countries can make progress?
Well, Kashmir, of course, remains a particularly nettlesome issue, and neither side, I think, is in any position to make any meaningful concessions. In Pakistan, it will be construed as a sign of weakness. In the case of India, it will require the particular government that is in power, which has a hawkish disposition to give up on a sort of a core ideological issue. So consequently, I don't think one should expect any significant movement on that particular conundrum. On the other hand, one can enhance people-to-people contacts. One can tackle the issue of increased border trade despite the setback that has taken place, and also try and avoid contention on the sharing of the Indus River waters.
Mosharraf, the decision to postpone imports from India of sugar and cotton was taken by a cabinet committee. That committee was chaired by the Prime Minister, Imran Khan. But we do know that Pakistan has a very powerful, a very influential military. In fact, the country's military chief recently said it's time to, quote, bury the past. What role is the military playing in what is going on right now?
I think without the military's ownership, the fact that the DGMOs came together to renew the 2003 line of control ceasefire and the fact that some of the statements that have come from both civilian and military leaders, those facts would not exist without a understanding and a green light from Rawalpindi that the country is ready to move in that direction. I think the problem, and one of the analytical points or sort of, gaping holes, maybe, sort of blind corners in this entire conversation are the people of Kashmir. I think that even if General Bajwa is very keen to bury the past, the people of Kashmir are not so keen to forget the bodies that they've had to bury in the past. And I think that without addressing the interests of the people of Kashmir, which include a rejection of Indian identity, which is foundational really to the dispute. There is, of course, an element of territorial, ambition and aspiration on in both New Delhi and in Islamabad. But at the foundation of the Kashmir dispute is actually the people of Kashmir. So as long as the measures that Pakistan takes or the measures that India takes do not actually address the people of Kashmir, we're not really going to see any sustainable change. We can see, and we've seen this over the last 20 years, there have been moments where it seemed like things are about to be resolved and things are getting better. And then for one reason or the other, the momentum in those talks and in that process, it either slows down or sputters completely. Now, the tradition is that we blame, and to an extent, rightly, we blame the prevalence of attacks by militant groups that find their origins on Pakistani territory that are supportive of Kashmiri independence or Kashmiri separatism and a rejection of the Indian occupation in Kashmir. But there is also fundamentally, and this is the real problem that New Delhi in particular doesn't want to talk about, but also a ceasefire and peace process seeking Pakistan is uncomfortable talking about. And that is the will of the people of Kashmir. So as long as that part of the equation doesn't get addressed, all the ambition that Prime Minister Khan and General Bajwa, who have demonstrated their intent through the Balakot crisis after August 5th, 2019, and in everything that's happened in the last few weeks, that demonstrable commitment cannot be fulfilled without addressing that gap, which is the people of Kashmir. And by Kashmir, particularly, I mean the people of occupied Kashmir, the valley itself.
Ather Zia, what is the prevailing sentiment in Kashmir right now? As we just heard Mosharraf tell us, that there is a rejection of Indian identity. So is the feeling there that only an independent state will be acceptable?
Well, the feeling in Kashmir regarding a political solution is right to self-determination. And I think that has been reiterated twice in the recent years by the United Nations Human Rights Commission as well in the two reports that came out. So I would say that the subscription by and large is for right to self-determination. There is a huge sentiment for independence. There is also a sentiment for Pakistan. So all of that has to be taken into consideration. And what has also happened since 2019 is a deliberate silencing and institutionalization of that silencing has been imposed on Kashmiris. And that should be noted, because in every decade what has happened as these talks go back and forth, whether there are confidence building measures and whether there is ceasefire on the LOC, which by the way was called the ceasefire line till 1971, which is when the bilateral talks happened between India and Pakistan, and it came to be known as LOC. And a lot of Kashmiris reject that vocabulary as well, because ceasefire line to them meant that this is a dispute to be resolved and this is something active. And that bilateral thing has again overshadowed the sentiments of Kashmiris. So I would say by and large, the right to self-determination is mandated by the UN, and that's what Kashmiris have been seeking in every decade. The sentiment for independence, as I said, is huge, and sentiment for Pakistan as well. And what you see happening right now is, again, the big countries kind of taking power of the narrative, whichever way they want. And there is silencing of Kashmiris again in this decade as well. And that status quo continues for them.
Sumit Ganguly, do you see India accepting that, the right of self-determination on the part of the Kashmiris, perhaps some kind of autonomy that falls perhaps just a little bit short of outright independence?
Um, Ironically, in multiple works long before August 5th, 2019, I had argued precisely that. In fact, I had argued for a number of different possible pathways towards autonomy and a devolution of power. Of course, these ideas and these propositions were completely demolished as a consequence of the decision of August 5th, 2019. And under the present circumstances, particularly with this government in office, I think that is a pipe dream. And I'm not endorsing the government's position. I'm only reflecting what the government's position is. The mere fact that they stripped what little autonomy did exist under Article 370 and Article 35A of the Indian Constitution, and did it in an extraordinarily high-handed fashion, suggests that any notion of addressing the grievances that percolate in the valley, particularly amongst the Muslim population of the valley, just does not concern this particular government.
Michael Kugelman, looking at the bigger picture, when I say bigger picture, I mean involving the United States, at this attempt by Pakistan and India at Detente. US President Joe Biden, he recently announced a virtual climate change leaders summit. 40 world leaders will be there. India and Bangladesh are among the countries who've been invited, but Pakistan's not there. What's the reasoning behind this?
I know that in Pakistan, many believe this may have been some type of deliberate snub to suggest that Pakistan is not seen in Washington as important to be in this at this event, or that the U.S. is trying to play hardball to try to get Pakistan to be more helpful to the U.S. in Afghanistan. I don't think that's it. I think it's basically an issue of how the U.S. frames its relationship with Pakistan. I mean, certainly the Biden administration recognizes that Pakistan is a climate vulnerable country and that it should be at the table for discussions around climate change. But I think the idea here is that the administration simply does not frame its relationship with Pakistan through issues that go beyond hard security issues like counterterrorism or the issue of Afghanistan. And in that regard, I think that the view in Washington is that it simply doesn't want to have that type of element to its relationship with Pakistan. And I think that's a mistake. And I recently argued this in a recent article, that it makes sense for the U.S. to try to reach out to Pakistan to discuss these issues of climate change, particularly because both leaders, or Joe Biden and Imran Khan, are both very passionate about the issue of climate change and climate change mitigation. And certainly, climate change is something that plays out across the region, across all of South Asia, including Kashmir as well. There's a lot of climate vulnerability everywhere. So I think this could be an opportunity to build more cooperation between the U.S. and Pakistan. But unfortunately, I really don't think that's in the cards. And now John Kerry, the climate change czar of the Biden administration, he's now announced he's going to be taking a trip to the region. He'll be going to India and he'll be going to Bangladesh, but not Pakistan. And I think that will certainly, the optics of that may not be received very well by some in Pakistan.
Mosharraf, how is this being seen in Pakistan? The State Department here in Washington said recently that when it comes to relations between the United States and India on the one hand, United States and Pakistan on the other hand, that they don't see this as any kind of zero-sum proposition.
Well, I think, foreign ministries and State Departments everywhere often say many things that are meant to address the question at hand without actually answering that question. So I think what the State Department says about the independence of its relations with India from its relations with Pakistan, I think, should be treated with a half a kilo of salt minimum. I think that the climate summit snub is going to be noted in Islamabad. Unfortunately, I think whatever the U.S. is trying to achieve, and I think it is a greater focus and a greater acquiescence from Islamabad and Rawalpindi on issues related to Afghanistan and counterterrorism, I think it'll have the opposite effect. I think it'll further burnish the credentials of Pakistani hawks who all along have said that there is no wiggle room, and that the U.S. is committed not only to its friendship and strategic partnership with India, but to do so to the exclusion and to the damage of Pakistani security interests. If those hawks begin to dominate the Pakistani discourse as a result of these kinds of snubs, then the responsibility for those outcomes will and should be laid entirely at the U.S., because there's really no defense of the exclusion of Pakistan. Pakistan is a top 5 vulnerable country on the planet. No country has worked more closely with the United States on counterterrorism as has Pakistan. No country is as responsible for the defeat of Al-Qaeda and for the dragging of the Taliban, kicking and screaming, to the negotiation table in Doha. When Pakistan, despite all these factors, notwithstanding many of the legitimate concerns and complaints that the U.S. has, but when this kind of a partner is excluded from this kind of a summit, where there's no real security or counterterrorism benefit to the exclusion, it's just that a point is being made. The point might get made, but it might have the opposite effect that it's intended to.
Sumit Ganguly, one final question. Do you see any role for China in helping India and Pakistan resolve some of the differences that they have? On the Kashmir issue, India has ruled out, has rejected any outside mediation, saying that this is an issue between India and Pakistan and nobody else. But both countries, India and Pakistan, are also members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Can China play any role in this?
I'm sure that the PRC would like to play a role, and I'm sure that Islamabad would welcome such a role. But New Delhi, regardless of what government is in office, whether it's the current government or a different government, I just don't see New Delhi allowing or being willing to accept a Chinese role, especially in light of what has transpired since 2020 along the Sino-Indian border. Given the level of hostility and concern and anxiety about that border, the notion that India would allow the PRC to enter the fray with Pakistan on the issue, the very fraught issue of Kashmir, simply boggles the imagination.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.